A quick message before we get on with the podcast today. We're delighted to let you know that 101 Top Property Tips is going to be live to the world, live to the market on Wednesday, the 15th of July. We've got over 50 contributors to this book, people that have been in property for years and years and years with a wealth of experience, and everyone's teamed up together to provide various top property tips. The idea being that this helps you and it helps us, helps everyone to learn from the mistakes that other people have made. Now, whether you're a seasoned professional, whether you're just getting started in property, this book's going to have everything that you can think of, from tips on due diligence to tips on dealing with builders, dealing with architects. Wednesday, 15th of July, 101 Top Property Tips is going to be available to the world. You can buy it on Amazon, paperback and the Kindle version. So mark that date in your calendar. And now, on with the show. Welcome to another episode in this Expertcast series, and today we are deep diving into HMOs, houses of multiple occupation. Delighted to be joined today by Ian Denston, who requested that he introduce himself. So Ian, thanks for your time, and the floor's all yours.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you. We've known each other a few years now. Right, name's Ian Denston. As a profession, I'm an environmental health officer. Been in that profession for over 30 years now, started in 1988. God, that's a long time ago. Did the degree, worked as a full-time, but ended up investing in housing, and several reasons why I did that. One of them was, when I got my degree and I started working, the idea was, at that time, do this work, get a good wage, get a good pension, and then retire. Great. You only get one go at life, and that's sort of your life, very simply planned out. But in the first year of working there was a guy there, I won't say his name, he was a lovely guy, 63 years old, 18 months to retirement, and he died. He just didn't turn up for work one day. Could have retired earlier, didn't know what to do, didn't have a plan for the future, had the full pension waiting for him. And I got to thinking, this isn't a plan, this is a waste. And I thought, even if you did, make it to 65 and have a few years left, they're not the best years of your life, so I wanted to get out earlier. So I wanted to make alternative plans. So that's when I set my first goal. And that was to be able to retire between the age of 50 and 55. Well, I'm 54 now, I could retire. I don't want to, I don't need to, but I could, which is a sort of success. It's a bit strange, really. And I don't have a normal life like normal people. But there's benefits to that. When I was working, I had the salary and I spent my salary, and I did save a little bit, but not much. It was hard to save because you never had much left over. Got a lot more in the bank now. Even though my income's up and down, it's forced me to save and manage the money. Assets, I've got a lot more assets than I ever had. When I bought a car, I didn't have to buy the cheapest car I could afford to splash out, but I've been very disciplined with money, so that's really, really helped me with that. So what did I do and how did I get there? Well, various things happened to me, but one of the things that happened was I used to work enforcing the law against landlords. And the image you have as landlords is that you're all greedy and grasping and too much money. And that's not true. Most landlords are actually decent people. And I used to get along with them. And I remember in the buy-to-let boom speaking to them, and they told me how to buy houses and recycle your money. I thought, oh, that's great. And I was saying to them things, well, I actually was the environmental health officer in my team who served more notices than anybody. I got more compliance work than anybody. But I was only hitting the bad landlords, and the good landlords, I would treat them like human beings. I would say, well, hey, this is what's wrong, this is why it's wrong. And they said, well, it's what I suggest to put it right, but if you can give me another suggestion, please do. Often, theirs were better than mine. Many of them were builders, much more practical experience than me. I didn't know it all. And in many ways, they knew more than me. And so when they come along and say, well, we'll do it this way or that way, and at the end of the day, the tenants benefit. And isn't that good? The landlord gets a protection because he's not going to injure a tenant, or less likely to, as you'll know with risk assessment, you never take away the chance. And he gets my approval. I was happy with that. In return, they showed me how to buy properties. And then I remember I had a meeting with my manager, and I said, is this okay if I do this? And he agreed. And that was in February time. I raised my first finance, remortgaging the house I'm in now, got £55,000. By June, so 4 months, I had 3 properties. Within a year of that, I had 7. Unfortunately, that was when the buy-to-let boom ended and it stalled. Then I had a difficulty with my manager, who decided I shouldn't have done this, and ended up in me getting a massive opportunity. I won't go into too many details, but I ended up suspended for work for 17 months on full pay, which meant I could set up my own business. What a brilliant opportunity. And then they had to pay me off work. And then I bought 4 more properties with that money. So, I was away with the properties. I had a lot more than most people, and the income was good. And in that time, I'd set up a letting agency. And the letting agency had replaced my salary. And then building that up, one of the main ways I found for building that was I worked for a company that was called Russ Whitney, who were a training company. And I went through various name changes. And those name changes were, they joined up with a Rich Dad Corporation that became eventually Elite Legacy, who have now changed to Advanced Asset Academy. And I still work for them. I started in 2006. So it's just about 14 years, it will be soon later this year, that I've been training landlords. And what I train them on is housing standards and HMO licensing, HMO standards specifically, and HMO licensing. Because one way you can turbocharge your property portfolio is with HMOs. With a buy-to-let, you'll make so much money a month. With a HMO, if it works correctly, you can multiply that up by a reasonable factor, 2, 3, 4 times, something like that, if you do it correctly. It can be difficult if you don't do it correctly. And it is a regulatory minefield. There's so many rules and regulations with HMOs. And I've found that I'm becoming, as the environmental health officer in the private sector, I'm becoming the go-to person for many of these legacy students. I'm the one who tells them what to do. And many of them have invested with me, and there's no obligation there, but I've in Hull, if any of them want to invest in buy-to-lets in Hull, often they'll come to me and I end up managing them, and that's how I build up my property portfolio. However, I, in some ways, have been a victim of success, because I used to, maybe about 6 years ago, I had 4 HMOs. But there's so many people piled into the HMO sector, it's hit the profits. So I've just got out. I've turned them all into family lets, because you've got to make these plans for the future. There's no point in struggling with something if, the ideal is not to hang on to something that's going to not work. Move over, be flexible, have an exit strategy, all of that. So I've moved them over, and they're all family lets. And I won't say how much I'm getting a month, but it's in excess of £5,000 from my properties, which is great. It's enough to live off. That's one of the reasons why I can retire. Regulation, though. Regulation, and back to being an environmental health officer. I'm changing from the letting agency back to independent environmental health officer. I've started up a company. My company is Environmental Health Housing Services Limited, and I specialise in the housing side of environmental health. Environmental health has 3 main areas of specialism. You can go into food, you can go into pollution, or you can go into housing. There is a smaller section, port health, as well. When you look at the 3 sections, people normally think about food as environmental health officers, but actually the one that affects people's health more than anything is housing. And when you look at the figures for accidents, for illness, all that sort of thing, so few people get food poisoning compared to having an injury in the house. And then pollution comes somewhere in between the two, but that's hard to measure quite often. And so housing, I think, is from that perspective, from a professional perspective, is the best. It's also been a political focus just lately. There's been so many more regulations coming out and changes, and over the last 10 or 15 years, it's massively changed. A new Housing Act came out. and came into effect. A new system of inspection, HMO licensing came in rather than registration. And there's other forms of, there's mandatory HMO licensing, but there's also additional HMO licensing. There's selective licensing for anything else, basically, in the private rented sector. And then on top, there's a system of inspection that's changed. With that, lots of guidance has come out, and keeping on top of that is, actually, I quite like it, but most people don't. In addition to all of that, there's planning. Planning rules have changed. Because of the proliferation of HMOs, you could see it. Money's coming into the sector because there's a reward from investing in the sector, but there's also additional dangers from that sector. So what's happening is regulation is being improved. Personally, I think the best way to improve a sector is to encourage people to invest in the sector, because regulation only catches part of it. If you've got a supply and demand situation where your tenants have got something to choose between, they'll go for the best. And then the best tend to be better regulated or better standards, and with better looked after tenants. So I maintain nothing does more for the housing sector than a good economy. If the economy is doing well, if there's money around, it's great. But we've got regulation, we've got to comply with it. Regulation with housing is it's something where people, I don't think, realise how vulnerable they are. And one of the key reasons is what's called strict liability. It's where, with law, there is a saying, ignorance is no defence of the law. Actually, usually it is. With strict liability, it's not. The burden is firmly on the shoulders of the owner of the property, and to some extent the agent as their representative, to ensure the property is compliant. And then you have the council environmental health officers and their enforcement officers going around trying to find something wrong. I have a friend who is a lawyer who works with the Residential Landlords Association. They've changed now, he might have changed. He was the company secretary for them. Together with him, we tried to put together Acts of Parliament, regulations, statutory orders and guidance notes and all sorts of things applying to the private rented sector. We gave up at about 250. I reckon there's probably about 350, 400 different rules, regulations, etc. That apply to the private rented sector. It is a regulatory nightmare. It reminds me of when I was young and I had a car, and I remember passing a police speed trap, being very smug, thinking, you can't catch me, I'm not going fast enough. And my dad said, be careful. He said, because if they decide to stop you, they will find something wrong with your car. So don't be smug. And I thought, okay, he's right. Housing is a similar thing. I could guarantee, as an environmental health officer, I could go around your own home and find something wrong if you're an owner-occupier, because believe it or not, the system of inspection and enforcement applies to every property, including your own home. So if you've got a garden path with a puddle on it that freezes in the winter, the council could serve a notice on you for that. You might think, there's a puddle. Yeah, in the winter it freezes, granny goes over there, slips on it, breaks her hip. It's quite serious, and it is serious. The potential for accidents in a home is massive. I looked at some figures some time ago, I've got them somewhere, where looking at the chances of accidents and deaths in the workplace, while travelling, and in the home, add them together, the home just dwarfs the number of mortality and morbidity stats for the other two. It's massively great. It's something like 6 times as great. And it's because we spend so much time in our home, and there are inherent risks with the home. And this is why we get regulated. And the system of regulation, it's gone away from a standard. Because the 1985 Housing Act had the fitness standard, which sounds great. Standard. It's either right or it's wrong. Actually, it can be right, wrong, or disrepair, somewhere in between. Now, it's never right or wrong. It's always how good can you get it, and how low can you make the risk. So, and it accepts that you cannot remove risk. So let's look at a house, and you look at a house with electricity in it. How do you remove the risk from electricity? Remove electricity? Well, no, because there's a benefit to electricity. So what do? You make it as safe as you reasonably can. And you look at electrical systems 10, 15 years ago, most of them didn't have RCDs and didn't have the MCBs, or maybe they had MCBs, most of them, but a lot of them didn't. They'd have the wire fuses, which are okay. No, that's expected. And within July this year, you're getting the electrical safety checks coming in. You're going to have to put them in everywhere. Unless there's a very good reason for not putting them in. Now, that's not a bad thing. You put them in, and now electricity really is not dangerous unless it's been tampered with or incorrectly put in. So that's the way it works. You make it as safe as you reasonably can. You don't accept any unnecessary risk, and that means that it gets a bit more complicated. You need a bit more knowledge. It's a dynamic situation. What's okay today might not be okay next year, because technology might have moved on, or the price of something that was unrealistic last year has come down and it's more expected to put in. An example I'll give. Smoke detectors. The smoke and carbon monoxide regs require a detector on every floor of a property. That's fine. Additional regulation requires that if it's a bigger property, you might need to interlink it because of the chances of a smoke detector on one floor not being audible on a different floor. That's fine. But normally you wouldn't have to interlink. It's perfectly fine. However, you can interlink them quite easily now with detectors. It costs about 40 quid. I remember a year ago, they were over 50 quid. They're coming down in price already. Why can't you put them in anyway? Now, I've got them in my house. Great. I press the button on one of them, the whole house erupts with noise. So if there's a fire in my garage, which is joined onto my house, I will know about it. I've tested those. It's easy to put in, easy to test, and they're becoming affordable. When they come down to £20 each, can you justify not putting them in? Now, imagine stood up in the coroner's court saying, well, I wanted to save 10 quid or 20 quid on my smoke detectors. That's why my tenant died. He couldn't hear the detector when there was a fire downstairs. You haven't got a defence. So that's the sort of thing you've got to think about. Now, HMOs, houses are regulated enough. There's enough rules, regulations, requirements, assessments, etc., etc., etc. on houses. But HMOs are a different animal. And why are they a different animal? Well, look at your house. Your family lets, and you live in there. And I'm in a house now. It's a decent-sized house, 3-bed house. I've got 3 children there. They're a bit, some of them are bigger than me, but they're children to me anyway. And we all live together as a family. And it's a totally different type of use to a HMO. If you put 5 individuals in here, the behaviour would be different. You might think that's fine. Presents totally different risks. Requirements. So, in your HMO, people might not socialise with each other. They might not get along. There might be some resentment. One person might not do the washing up. Another person might be vegan, and the other person uses a grill pan for their sausages. And you get all these daft things going on, and people don't communicate. And so the landlord needs to put in systems to protect the tenants, because you can't trust them always to protect themselves, and to not just protect them from things like fire, but make sure that they've got facilities in their sockets in their bedrooms, have them checked, make sure that they've got enough washing facilities so they can be hygienic, not that students are hygienic, and cooking facilities, etc., etc., etc. The list can go on. So with all of that, you have to accept that the regulation will be different to a house. Now, this is where you get in. I'll give you an example there. If there's a fire in my house, and I hear the alarm going off and my kids are dead to it because they're fast asleep, I'm going to wake them up and we'll get out. I'm not going to leave them behind. I've invested too much in them. But imagine you're in that HMO and there's somebody in that HMO and they're on the ground floor, and there's somebody 2 floors above and they don't really like that because they're lazy and they don't do the washing up or something, and they're always smoking dope anyway. And he's probably stoned if he's in his room, and you might not wake him up. And there's a fire in the kitchen, you've got to take a risk to get them. You're not so inclined to do that. And so you've got 2 factors increasing the risk there. You've got a greater chance of there being a fire because there's maybe 5 people cooking independently in that kitchen. And if there is a fire, you've got more of a chance of somebody having a harm outcome because of that fire, because less likely to go and warn them. So, hey, you need different things to protect them. You need fire separation. You need an alarm system so that they are warned if there's a fire. So it doesn't need somebody to set it off. It will automatically set itself off. You could argue you need firefighting equipment in the house to help, if there is a fire, stop it. But I'm very hesitant to require anything like that, with one exception, and that's a fire blanket. And actually, under the Lake House Fire Safety Guidance, which is the guidance you tend to lean on with this, fire blankets are recommended for every house. Even your family lets, even your own home, I'd recommend you put one in. If there's a small fire, they're easy to use. And if we had one a few years ago where an electric iron caught fire. I don't know why, I didn't expect it. I wasn't there. My daughter quickly grabbed the fire blanket. They unplugged it, grabbed the fire blanket, wrapped it up and rushed it outside. No damage, no harm. Well, that's a good idea. It's why we have one. So we always have one. And you can get them for about £5 or even less, I think, in some places online. So you put them in. However, I wouldn't recommend fire extinguishers unless I have to have them put in. Imagine a water fire extinguisher. First of all, rarely does it get used on a fire. It's a bit of fun, somebody setting it off, and in a HMO, well, who did it? You can never prove, and who becomes responsible. The other thing is, if you squirt them in the wrong place, you can cause a lot more harm. It's quite, look on YouTube and have a look at the fire service putting water into a chip pan and show you the effect if you're not sure of what it is. If there's a chip pan fire and you just splash a bit of water in there, it will erupt, and that could be very, very, very dangerous. The other thing is if they squirt it onto electrics. Now, electrics, okay, after the consumer board, it should be protected. It should just trip out. But between the consumer board and the meter, you've got a fuse that's probably at 100 amps. That's a lot to take. Even connected by water to it, that would give you a hell of a belt, and it could potentially be fatal. Go the wrong side of that fuse and you're into the national grid. So these are the reasons why I don't put any fire extinguishers in unless I have to. And even then, I will make a recommendation that any requirement like that is removed for these reasons. And it's not about cost. Houses are insured and tenants are not. So regulation with HMOs. Well, you have two basic areas of regulation with HMOs. You have planning and you have the environmental health. And they, please don't confuse them. Planning is planning permission. So HMO can operate outside of an Article 4 area under C3 use, up to 6 people who are not related. And it's the same as a family let in the same area. However, go over 6 and you need planning permission. That's called, you're going from C3 use to what's called sui generis. However, in an Article 4 area, a whole new planning consent is needed for what's called C4 use, and that's for 3 to 6 people who are not related. So you might go, and it's perfectly possible for this to happen, contact environmental health, say, well, I've seen this wonderful house, what do I need to do to bring it up to standard? And that might be quite helpful and say, do this, do that, do the other. You buy it, you do this, do that, do the other. And you make a very good HMO, and then the planners say no. And unless you've got the planning permission, no means no. And so you cannot use it. And you've probably got a very expensive and very compliant family let. And it's going to be hard to get your return on investment there. So be careful there. Planners are not looking at the safety of people. They're looking at the amenity of the area. And they have quite strong powers. So you have to recognise that. And the amenity of the area isn't just the appearance of a building, it's how the use of it can affect an area. So they might be looking at the mixture of tenures in an area, and they should have a planning policy to say what they're looking at, say how they're looking at it. So it might say something such as that no more than this percentage of HMOs down the street, or no more than one HMO within 50 metres of another, for example. Something such as that. So they should say that in their planning policy. And the way to get around that is to challenge their planning policy. But you need a planning consultant for that. I'm an environmental health officer. Environmental health are looking for safety. Looking for safety for your tenants, for their visitors, and for even people walking by the property, make sure that it's safe for you, for what you are using it for. So when we're looking at a family let, there's a certain amount of regulation. Looking at a HMO, there is all of that plus more. And so part of that, and to help them with that, they have licensing. Now, prior to 2006, when the 2004 Act came into effect, or this part of it came into effect, the use of HMO regulation, registration, every HMO had to be registered. And to be fair, most of them weren't. It wasn't very good. And as an environmental health officer, I got quite good at recognising HMOs. Usually, it's through walking around the back and having a look and looking at the mess in the garden, looking at the multiple Sky TV dishes, looking at how many bins they've got, furniture in the garden, something like that. Even that wasn't definitive because a well-run HMO could go under the radar. And then the council would, what happened then was licensing came in, and it became a requirement to get a HMO license in two separate situations. One, a mandatory HMO license if your property was 5 or more people and it was 3 or more stories. And it could be any HMO would require, that was a mandatory HMO license. Any HMO could be required to have an additional HMO license if the council had brought in an additional HMO licensing scheme for that area. And they would do that where they found that there were problems due to the HMOs and they weren't covered by the mandatory licensing scheme, so the smaller HMOs. And they would regulate every HMO in the area, bring in the conditions, and the idea would be that would sort out the problem. And all HMOs will be regulated, not just the bad ones. So unfortunately, everybody gets caught. However, the good ones should be more or less compliant anyway. Problem is you've got a license to pay for as well. Now that's all well and good, but I think councils often treat this as a good source of income, and you'll find that being a landlord, you're treated as a good cash cow, a source of income, and that's one way that initially came in. Some HMO licenses have been challenged because they're too expensive. Councils have been asked to justify it and sometimes been asked to give money back because licensing schemes such as HMO and selective licensing are what's called non-fiscal measures. They're supposed to only cover the cost of running the scheme. Cannot have an excess. They can make a loss and they've got to make up the difference. However, as bad as that sounds for the council, imagine that you're running a business and you've got a monopoly, and although you're not allowed to make a profit, you can cover all your costs. Well, you're not going to scrimp on the costs, are you? You're going to be expensive. So I would suggest that some of them could be run a lot cheaper. And as you look around the country, you will see a big difference in the prices of HMO licenses. And that just, to me, illustrates the point. However, HMO licensing changed in 2018, October 2018, and they took away the requirement for 3 or more stories. So now every HMO with 5 or more people needs a license. So it gets a lot more, surprising number more properties in because there are a lot of 2-story properties that were made into HMOs. Initially, it was aimed at the higher risk HMOs, hence the 3-story bit. Now I think they're looking at, almost regulation for regulation's sake, or is it for the income that they can get? Because I think they're covering maybe too much. But because HMO licensing, you've got to bear in mind with HMO licensing, if you have a HMO that doesn't need a license, you're still subject to the HMO management regulations. The number of people I've heard of say, oh, do I need to do this? Fire precautions, fire safety, electrical safety, anything like that. It's not a licensable HMO. Yes, under the HMO management regs. And if you don't, the penalties are quite punitive. And so you don't get away with it. The difference between a licensed HMO and a non-licensed HMO is basically the cost of the license. Although the councils do have some powers to go a little bit beyond that with licensing. There's a statutory order that was made out. That's for HMOs, not for houses, not for selective licenses. Now, you can challenge them in various ways on the cost, but this is quite difficult. In Hull, we had the big change in HMO licensing where they went from the 3-story to the 2-story, or to any HMO under 3-story. And the council allowed for, I think there's about 2,000 extra HMOs, and there's a lot more than that. I am managing 3 HMOs that they're requiring licenses from October 2018. We've got the applications in, haven't processed anything. We're way beyond that now. We're over 18 months past, and I've had one communication on one of them, and I have the feeling I frightened them, but that's their problem. Nothing to worry about if they get it right. But I think that they will take too much money in, because they've set the fee based on fewer HMOs than they've got, so they've got more licensing money coming in. They are behind with their licensing because they haven't got enough people in, but that's a good thing because it keeps their costs down. Their income's gone up. They might have to refund us. We'll give them another year or so. We'll make an FOI request. Compare their income to their costs, and if there's an excess, we'll have it back. And that's their problem. They'll have to refund us. They are looking at landlords for income. Another way they can look at landlords for income is the cost of non-compliance. I've already hinted about various things, but when you look at, let's say you run a HMO and you don't bother getting a license, what could happen to you if you need a license? Well, first of all, you probably won't comply with all the conditions, but you might. Let's say you're really good and you comply with the conditions. There's a fine for not having a HMO license where you need a HMO license, and there is no limit on that fine. It can go, in theory, to infinity. In reality, it will be limited by factors such as how bad your HMO is, how compliant you've been in the past, how experienced you are, basically whether you should have known better. If you've been naive, it's not much defence, but it's a bit of mitigation. You can get a penalty down. But do it again, they'll throw the book at you. This is bankrupting material. However, there's 2 other ways that you can lose money on that through regulation. One is penalty charge notices. Let me explain a little bit about those. A fine is a criminal offence, and councils prosecute you. You get fined if it's successful, and the money goes to central government. If the council lose, they pay the cost. If they win, they get the costs off you, but the fine, central government. You can see why they're not. There's a bit of a risk to the council there. You can see why they're not keen to do too many fines. Penalty charge notices is slightly different. It's not a criminal offence. The recovery of a penalty charge notice. It's a civil offence. It's easier to recover the money. They get the money. Now, the penalty charge notices for non-compliance with HMO management regs or licence conditions is up to £30,000 per condition or regulation. Now, that's unlikely to be £30,000 each first time, but it's easy to miss 2 or 3 things out. I mean, let's say you've forgotten to put your name and address up in the hallway. Bang, maybe £5,000 for not putting your name and address up or contact details. That's punitive. I think way beyond what the offence, but the idea is you've got to comply and you've got to tell the tenants who to contact. They might know anyway, but you've got to tell them. Other things could be wrong. You could not have your your gas safety could have fallen out of date. Something such as that. Another £5,000. All of these things can come into play, and then the council get to keep these. You do it again, it won't be something like £5,000. It'll be more, and this is, like I say, bankrupting material. But could you imagine councils are getting cutbacks? They've had years of austerity. The government have either cut back their funding or frozen it, which effectively is a cutback of inflation. They've had to lose staff when people retire, or maybe even lay people off, lay off contractors, all sorts of cutbacks. The one area where it's becoming well funded is HMO licensing, and that's because of the income they can get off us. And outside of HMO licensing for the rest of private sector housing, they can get penalty charge notices. Now imagine that they get paid so much a year from their government, from their council funds to run their service. But now that the council know that they can get alternative funding, that might be cut back even more. And you could imagine the team meeting in private sector housing. So, we've just lost another £60,000 off our budget. I'm going to have to let go of one of you and maybe cut you another to part-time or something such as that. And unless you can go out and sell a few of these notices and get a few landlords, it sort of motivates them. And you've got to be compliant. You've got to be so careful. And remember what I said earlier. It's up to you to find out what you're supposed to do. It's because this is what's called strict liability. It's where, and let me go over that again, the strict liability is where there is no defence to say you never knew. There are defences to say, well, you've not complied, to say, well, I tried to comply. So there's what's called due diligence and best practical means, where you've maybe put in the requirements, but something's gone wrong despite your system of checking. And things do go wrong, it does allow for that. But if you've not done something because you never knew, your fault, you're guilty. And all you've got to lean back on is mitigation there and try and get the penalty down. And the council will be rubbing their hands together and thinking, well, hey, we've got more income here. And landlords, well, I'm not sure if you can insure against that. And it could easily put people out of business. So you've got to get compliance. You've got to make sure you're compliant. Here's where I know I give training, but I am a fan of training. I very much like it. I am about to get registered with the Chancellor Institute of Environmental Health as one of their trainers for the Housing Health and Safety Rating System. Be able to issue the training courses, issue the certificates. And despite that, I still go on training myself. And I remember going on a training session once. It was with the RLA. And when we introduced ourselves in the room, this woman there, I said, well, I'm an environmental health officer, I think she was really nervous. She thought, well, he knows more than me because he does high to a higher level. I said to her in the break, I said, don't worry. I said, if I know 90% of what you're telling me, I've got 10% to learn. And if you would do something different to me, I will compare what you do to what I do. And maybe I'll change. And I don't want to be an old guy stuck in the ways of 20 years ago. As technology and things have moved on, you've got to move on with it. And that's where you've got to invest in yourself. And if you ask all these Warren Buffetts and the like, what's the most important thing to invest in above everything else, and say yourself. And so if you enter into something without knowledge, especially when you could have got that knowledge, you're a fool. And here it's becoming more and more and more important because the consequences of not knowing. I foresee an increase. I think it'll have to die down because you can only squeeze so much out of them, but there'll be an increase in penalty charge notices on landlords. There's another way you can lose money as well. If you have a HMO that needs a license and you operate it without a license, or a house that needs a selective license and you don't have a license, your tenants can claim their rent back for up to 12 months. I once was approached by a tenant in a HMO. She said, well, I'm living in an HMO, I ain't got a license. Can I get my rent back? I thought, well, I've never actually tried this. And I asked her a few questions. Well, how many people live in there? There's about 10 of them. Do you have an agreement? Yes. And it could be a license or a tenancy agreement, doesn't matter. But where is it? Okay. Looked on the council website, looked for their list of HMOs, which some of them don't produce, but they did. It wasn't on there. A list of licensed HMOs, it wasn't on there. And then I said, well, have you paid rents? Yeah, I pay by standing order every month. So we've got everything. Proof that she's paid rents, proof that it's not a licensed HMO, proof that it's a HMO that should be licensed. So about 10 people living there, they're not related. And so I went on the justice.gov.uk website, and about 10 minutes later, I said, right, there we go. Pay your fee, and there's about 150 quid, and you can claim a year's worth of rent back. And that was about £4,500. Oh, I don't know if she did it, but it was very easy to do. And I don't think the landlord had a leg to stand on. I was in a dilemma a couple of years ago. My daughter at Liverpool University was in a HMO, 3-storey property. And there were 6 of them in there. And the landlord was a lovely guy. I just, out of interest, looked on Liverpool's website, looked at their list of HMOs. He wasn't there. He wasn't licensed. And I looked at it, and it was basically compliant, but there were 1 or 2 things which I wanted to tell. That's the way I am. And I thought, shall I, shan't I? I didn't. I couldn't do it to the poor guy. But we could have claimed all her rent back, and he wouldn't have had a leg to stand on. And I think he's going to get stung because he's in a difficult position where he's run a HMO for a number of years. It's not licensed. Now, if he goes to the council and says, "Can I have a HMO license?" they'll say, "Well, what have you been doing up to now?" And so he's got to, I don't know, be a bit creative. Say, "Well, I've only had 4 people in there," or something such as that. The guy's got to be careful. And these are the positions people are in. People have flown under the radar, but regulation will catch up with you. It's getting easier to catch you, and it's getting worth it for the councils to catch you, and they're getting motivated. So you've got to be so careful. I could go into all the different details of what you need in a HMO, but there are just so many. From the fire separation to the fire precautions to the how to fit a fire door. Little things like that. I've seen awfully fitted fire doors on properties that don't quite close properly. What good is that? It's pretending to be a fire door. I've seen alarm systems that have been put in that are really good, and then the tenant takes a battery out. Why? Because they like to smoke in the room. Well, have you inspected the property? Have you done your regular inspections to check that the LED's on the smoke detectors? You don't need an electrician to do that. And if you haven't, then your defence is reduced. That's the due diligence element of your defence. So you've got to make sure you're doing your inspections. And then every year or every 6 months, depending on the type of system, have your alarm checked by an electrician. Make sure it's functional. Make sure it's working. If there's any reason to check in between those times, do it. And you could be in a coroner's court trying to say, "Well, I didn't think it was worth it." You've just got to be careful of those things. It sounds a bit onerous, and I think to some extent landlords are picked on. But the responsibility with landlords is huge with with housing anyway, but with HMOs it's even bigger. You could kill somebody, not because you're mean and penny pinching, not because you're vindictive or anything like that, because of ignorance. Because you didn't put something in because you didn't realise you needed it. And that's one of the reasons why the regulation is pretty onerous. You've got to be careful. You've got to increase your knowledge or employ somebody who has greater knowledge than you, more experience, and who has probably made more mistakes in the past, but learn from their mistakes rather than making them yourself. And it's the way to go ahead. Right, what else do we need to know?
Well, I was gonna spin back and go back to the very start from an investor's point of view, in terms of, I would normally say that the principle of sort of identifying areas where HMOs may work, etc., is very similar to buy-to-let in terms of, you look at your fundamentals. Are there hospitals? Are there enough white collar jobs, blue collar jobs, or are you near a university? Those sort of things. So the fundamentals of locating an area are, I'd say, quite similar. And if people are listening to this are only just starting, then how would they, if they've identified an area that they think is going to work for a HMO? You mentioned things like Article 4. Some people listening to this might not know what an Article 4 is. So how would people find out if an area's got Article 4, who they need to speak to at the council, those sort of things? Let's try and go through the process of that. And I think that would be quite beneficial for everyone as well.
Yeah. Okay, so we're considering investments, and we're considering looking for where you should buy properties to make into HMOs or buy existing HMOs. Well, the first thing I'd say, if you're looking at buying existing HMOs, I would ask a question of the landlord who's selling a HMO. Why are you selling it? If it's making you easy money, why are you selling it? There might be a valid reason, but sometimes it's because it doesn't work. And it's very difficult to prove they've been dishonest. So you've got to take on the responsibility yourself and do the research yourself. And then you look at an area. Well, first of all, you've got to ask yourself, can you make a property into a HMO in this area? I would check the planning first, because fundamentally, if you've got the right type of house, any of that type of house, even if it's not suitable, can be made suitable. It's just a question of cost. But planning is a yes or no answer. Does it need planning permission? And if the answer is yes, is it likely to get it? Now, does it need planning permission? So planning, you first of all check if it's what's called an Article 4 area. How do you do that? Go on the council website. They're a bit difficult to negotiate, some of them, but persevere, because they should have plans on there. And it might be worth double checking in networking groups or even the council officers, making sure you've got the Article 4 areas identified. Because if you're buying in an Article 4 area, you need either an existing HMO or you need to get planning permission for any size HMO. An existing HMO, be careful that it actually does have permission, because although it may have been worked as a HMO for as long as necessary, it needs the proof. I've seen people buy them and then they can't find the proof, and the previous landlord, well, he's got his money, he's gone. And so it's at the purchase point is really the time to ask for the proof. Now, what proof will be sufficient to show that it's been used as a HMO for long enough? Because what you've got to do is prove that it's either a HMO from the day Article 4 came in and has never been changed to a family let in that time. It could have been empty, it cannot have been used as a family let. Or it's got to have had permission, have been used long enough as a HMO to get what's called a certificate of lawful use, and that's 10 years of unbroken use, I believe. But proving that is a point, always proving that. Now, the easiest way is if it's a student HMO and it's had the student council tax exemption, or if it's been a HMO where the landlord's paid the council tax, because council register them as HMOs, council tax. The Department of the Council register them as HMOs. And if they're prepared to confirm that it's always been, that might do. Confirm with the planners whether they'll accept that or not. And then licenses. If it's been a licensable HMO and always had a license, we'll confirm again whether the planners accept that that's proof enough, because there's always a chance that it could have been used as a family let with a HMO license. So other things such as rent accounts and tenancy agreements will help as well. And from experience, I find many landlords, particularly older landlords, don't keep enough records. And in fact, with the statute of limitations for financial matters, you don't need to go beyond 6 years. So if it's been an Article 4 area 8 years ago, you might find that they're not keeping that sort of information. Councils will often try to get rid of HMOs in an area and not allow them. They don't want too many HMOs because of the effect it can have on the area. That's debatable, the effect. Sometimes it's not a bad effect, it's a good effect. And they do provide a type of accommodation that, if it works, it must be in demand. So I'm thinking of an area in Hull where it's a student area. It's the most vibrant area of Hull. And why is it? Because of the students and the people they attract. And there's cafe, restaurants, bars, and lots of shops in the area. Nothing, I think, is empty in terms of commercial there, which is unusual this day and age in Hull. So it's a good area. So I think being too hard on the landlords with HMOs is dangerous, because it will push properties out to the periphery or just beyond the periphery of the Article 4 area. So be careful with Article 4. Be careful with your proof. You might find that you have to have a certificate of lawful use when you apply for finance. And you might come along and buy it cash and then try and think I'll finance it, and find that the mortgage company require that as proof that you've got planning permission, because they don't want to lend on something that might not be allowed to have that use. So ask your broker about that, because I'm not a financial advisor, but that's just from experience. Anyway, once you've got the planning side covered in Article 4, if you're not in an Article 4 area, by the way, you can go up to 6 people without planning permission. I've been told by a planner that they don't want you to do that in an area. Well, that doesn't matter. You can. Simple as. But what you need is planning permission if you go above 6 people, so 7 plus. You have an image problem to overcome with HMOs, because everybody thinks that they're going to be a problem. Everybody thinks that they will be full of party animals or drug users or something such as that. If not today, then maybe next year or the year after. They just don't want that risk next to what's probably their biggest investment of their lives, their own home. So I can understand them being a bit careful. We get lots of bad press, and it's usually not deserved. I always think of the sitcom The Young Ones, where you had, going back a few years now, so when I was young, but Rick Mail, Ed Edmondson, Nigel Planer, living as students in a really scruffy HMO, and that's what people think they're like. And I've seen some HMOs now that are really nice, but people will think, the young ones are something such as that. And with the turnover of tenants, you might get a bad one from it every now and again. So they are riskier. So make sure, first of all, that your planning's sorted out. You've got to make sure that the area works. Like I said earlier, if a landlord's selling a HMO, is he likely to sell a HMO that works when they make so much cash? Maybe if you offer him enough money, he would. But I would add to that, make sure it's likely to work in the foreseeable future. We've had people investing near universities, and then the university go and build loads of purpose-built accommodation, or there's a downturn in student numbers or something, and this university accommodation doesn't fill. So with the first-year students, so they're taking second-year students out of the HMO market. From experience, I found the university accommodation is ridiculously expensive. They will often charge in excess of double the rent levels on the private rented sector, and they're not much better. If anything, often they're not better. So you are competing there, but the universities push the first-year students straight into the halls of residence, which I think is a bit debatable, whether it's morally, if not legally, correct. They're making money out of students, and students end up with lots of debt. Other things are looking at what goes on in the area. I was told early days, you have the 10-minute rule with a HMO, everything within 10 minutes. Well, your bus stops, your route to work, your shops, and things such as that. I would suggest a 5-minute rule. Make it better. Students don't like to walk too far to university, but I've found in Hull that HMOs work best near the pickup points for the factories. Because the factories operated minibuses picking up in car parks and places and petrol stations, and you go around 6 o'clock in the morning, even earlier, and you'd find that the crowds of Eastern Europeans there, minibus arrives, some of them get in, off it goes, and that's where you put your HMO. You put it near there, and then you would use it as a selling point. Nursing, hospitals, places such as that would be useful. Any source of employment for that type of person. You're looking at people who are generally young, not married, maybe recent graduates, or Eastern Europeans who are fairly transient. They're working in factories where they're not expecting to stay there for their full career. All sorts of little jobs like that, and positioning them near there. Something else to bear in mind, there's a risk. You find a good area. You might not be the only one who finds a good area. So there you've got, once you're in the market, you're competing in the market. And if you end up not reinvesting in your HMO, it gets tired, then it becomes where tenants will think, well, I'll take the one next door, or this one down the street, which looks a lot better than yours. And when I've been checking my HMOs, I'll lay on the bed. And now you tend to get cheap mattresses that are about 100 odd quid. And some people say, I can get one for 80 quid. And think, yeah, that's great. You can't sleep on it. So why can't your tenants sleep on it? Because it's bringing you back or something like that. So you've got to make sure little things like that are invested in. You have to, well, some people recommend there's a big budget for HMOs, and you repaint rooms, you replace curtains, you replace mattresses, and be careful when you replace one mattress. We tend to sneak them in, because if one person sees a mattress coming in, think, oh, I'll have one. And the mattresses, when you're buying the decent ones and they're over 100 quid, suddenly 6 of them in a house, it's a lot of money. You keep on top of things like that, and then because of that, you tend to attract the better tenants, you tend to keep the better tenants. The worst tenants tend to move on anyway, and you tend to have a happier HMO. It's communal living. Communal living brings its own problems, so you've got to manage them very, hands-on really, and you're looking after people, grown-ups with childish problems, but that's why you pay more. I've not seen any HMOs with management of 10% or less. So it tends to be minimum 12, often 15 or 18%, and often plus VAT. But that's not unusual. And if you think, why are they that much more? Well, compare it to a family let. You're doing 3 monthly inspections. Usually nothing goes wrong and not much maintenance to organise. There's a lot more work with the HMO. A lot more work. So hence people charge more. And you've got to get used to managing this sorts of thing. Anyway, once you've found your HMO, you're confident of the area, you've found the property, you've got to get the right type of property. And you could make a good mistake here by buying the wrong type of property. Usually you need a bigger than normal property, bigger than your normal family let, because you need the means of escape, the hallway, landing stairs, rooms coming off that. You need a good kitchen diner area, because you need a common area in a HMO. You can have HMOs without common areas, but you have to have bigger sized bedrooms with that. And usually bedrooms are big enough, but there might be the small bedroom at the back that isn't. And then, excuse me. And then bring it up to standard, get it wired up to spec, get the alarm system in, get the fire doors in, get the fire separation, the ceilings, the walls, make sure all of that's in. And then make sure the decoration is good. I tend to go for skimmed walls. Although they mark easily, they paint easily as well. And forget magnolia. You've got to pick a nicer colour now. They're all after grey, monochrome, but sometimes with a dash of colour. I believe dark blue is the colour now. And we'll see. I'll take an advice off other people there, because I'm a little bit primary colour myself. Once everything's done, everything's in place, we tend to let a lot of our HMOs off recommendations. Our ex-tenants come back asking for somewhere, partly because they know what they're getting. They could get better, they could pay more, but they know what we have, they know what the place is like, they know that they just ring somebody and something happens, and they don't know that for sure with somebody else. So that's why that helps us do our job more easily. What else? Well, finance, I can't really give you financial advice other than maybe securing your planning permission beforehand, because that could be asked for. Licensing. Now, what you need to do with licensing, you need to make an application, you need to have certificates in place. Now, for mandatory HMO licensing, you don't need a license until you've got 5 or more people in. So you could put 4 people in your HMO and get together your license. You need your certificates. You need your electrical certificate, BS 7671, that lasts 5 years. You need your alarm certificate, BS 5839, and that lasts on a managed HMO for 1 year. A managed is where there's more visits, rather, as opposed to a different type of HMO where the flats in a building converted with that use. Okay, so if you have a HMO, you need a license. What do you need to do to get that license? You need various certificates. You need your fixed electrical certificate, so that's a check on all the fixed electrical appliances in the property apart from the alarm and emergency lighting. So that's under BS 7671. That lasts 5 years, and then unless you're making a change to the system. And then you need a check on the alarm system, BS 5839, and that lasts either 6 months or a year, depending on the type of system. Your normal HMO will be a 1 year one. The 6 months are for the non-managed properties, as they're called, and that's blocks of flats, where there are conversion, not with 1991 building regs, and 1 or 2 other things. Emergency lighting, you need a certificate on that, BS 5266, and get those. The same person does all of those, and you may need a PAT test, portable appliance test, and so that's everything that basically plugs in and can be moved. So your fridge, freezer, washing machine, toaster, microwave, anything like that you might supply. It's always worth, the tenants leave a few bits and pieces in there doing those, because they're only about £1 an appliance. So it's not too much, and you don't want tenants' dodgy appliances burning the place down, but more likely they'll just trip the electrics out and irritate everybody. The other thing you'll need, a gas safety certificate if you've got gas in the property. And what is ironically the hardest one to get is a good plan of the property. And it's got to be to scale plan, reasonably to scale. The reason is because you could be looking at escape distances and have detail on it down to including things, not just doors, windows, but radiators, electrical sockets, position of smoke or heat detectors, emergency lighting units, etc., etc. So all of those need including in the plan. And then you submit these with a completed application form to the council. The application form will ask for personal details from you, your agent, and your manager, potentially all three if they're different. Ask for information about previous criminal convictions, because they will want to know whether you have been convicted for things like Housing Act offences, fraud, sexual offences, violence, things such as that. And be careful there. I've had people come along who've had, I had one woman who in the past, her husband had been caught in a car park with a young lady, and he got done for indecent exposure. And that's quite, he didn't realise the significance of it. He can't manage a HMO or be a teacher or social worker or big things. So these things can come out of the blue. Once you have all of these and you've filled in the form, make the payments, and then you've made a proper application, provided you've done it correctly, then you can put the fifth person in. And then you can operate as a HMO until the council come along and do your inspection and give you a licence. Now, HMO licensing isn't like planning. There isn't public consultation on this. So they won't do things such as ask the neighbours whether they think there should be a HMO here, because they'll all say no. If you basically tick all the boxes and comply with it, you get the licence. And that's that. There is a chance that you might have a HMO that is, let's say, there's no additional HMO licensing, so you only need a HMO when you go to 5 or more people, and you've got 4 people in and you don't need a license, and you're happily sailing along, and one of your tenants puts somebody else in the property. Be careful of that. You've got to show that you're managing the property, you're making the due visits to the property, and if there's a suspicion that somebody else is living there, you've got to take action. And what you should do is, whatever you do it in writing. Write to them and inform them that that person cannot live there. If they're living there, they've got to move out. They need another primary residence, it's called. And if they are still living there, you've got to evict. And if you don't do that, you are running a licensable HMO without a license. And you could be caught where the tenants can claim the rent back. You can be prosecuted. To defend yourself against that, you need to apply for a temporary exemption notice from the council. From experience, the council won't know what that is, so you'll have to tell them. But that's basically exactly what it says. It's temporary exemption from HMO licensing because this HMO has accidentally become a licensable HMO, and that's a temporary measure. And you are taking the due precautions, due measures to bring it back under the threshold. And that should accept you from any prosecution, provided you're doing this in a timely manner. So you could get entrapped there by tenants causing you to commit an offence, and it seems very unfair. But it is an absolute offence, and you have only mitigation other than the temporary exemption notice. What else would you do with regard HMOs? One of the most important things, I think, just personally speaking from experience, is have other options. I said earlier, I had HMOs that have now converted to family lets because the market got competitive. And it was hard to secure a good rent. It was hard to keep them full. And you often find when it's like that the bad tenants are in command. Because you'll find they'll get into your property, if not now, at some point in the future, and they'll cause problems. And it all ends up costing you money. And I remember I had one where we made about £100 in a year profit. And it was partly because it was only 3 out of 5 rooms for most of the time, partly because one tenant was in arrears. Another, this same tenant insisted on buying electrical heaters and having them running 24/7 in his room. In the end, we managed to get rid of them, quick tidy up of the property, let it to somebody for £600 a month. I'm making about £4,000 a year on profit on that one, which is fine. Whereas I was hardly making anything as a HMO. I had another one where a 4-person HMO, one of the tenants moved a boyfriend in, and he just ended up being a complete idiot. And everybody else moved out. And I ended up thinking, well, that was marginal anyway, being a 4-bed HMO. And so I went into a loss with that one. But now that one's a family let on $520 a month, and I'm making a decent profit on that one. So I'm not making as much as I potentially can in a HMO, but you've not got to look at your potential, you've got to look at your actual profit. And unfortunately, I say that the only way to work out your actual profit and return on investments is to look backwards. And by then you're committed. So that's why you need an exit. You need to be able to do it to something else, or maybe even sell the property. And if you want to buy any of my properties, you can buy any of them. They're all for sale at the right price. It's money. It's about business. So you've not got to be precious about them. I might have sweated blood over one of them getting it going, but you're going to give me money for it, and it's enough money. I'll have your money. So I think that illustrates another problem people make, is they get emotional over it, and they end up making decisions based not on money. And one of the best moves I've made, I say me, I mean me and my wife. When I started the investment, in property, I started it with a loan on my house of £55,000, and then recycling money and building it up. I have used the money from my properties to pay that loan back. That's fully discharged, and my house, which I bought for £115,000 in 2001, which is now worth about £250,000. I've paid all that mortgage off apart from £50. And the reason I'm keeping £50 going is I can always reclaim the money. I've got about 70 grand that I could re-borrow. But I've been able to do that because of the cash flow on my properties. And I've also built my little project. I think you need a little project to keep you sane. And mine is a summer house, not a little thing. It's like over 4.5 meters wide at the end of my garden, brick built, timber and cedarwood shingle roof. And on tomorrow, I've got a pizza oven being delivered, and it looks absolutely fantastic. Got a bench at the back, got made a table, heavy duty. You can fit about a dozen people without being too cramped in there. And had a barbecue there recently. All paid for by my properties.
I hope you're social distancing in that barbecue.
It was only family, the people living here.
Fair enough. For the purposes of the recording, by the time people are listening to this, then that oven would have been installed. So yeah, everyone round to Ian's for pizza. I love the practicality of this as well, because it's, as you say, it's about, we've gone through how to identify an area, what you need to do, the differences between planning aspects, when you need to speak to the council, when you might not need to speak to the council, different regulations, and then also covering exit strategies as well. As you've pointed out, there might be times if it's not quite working, you need to either, or you might want to then sell, or make the decision to revert back to C3. If you've got just to clarify, if you've got a property in you got a licensed HMO and it's not doing too well, and then you go back to C3, could you then move it back to an HMO straight away, or do you have to go through planning again? How does that work?
If it's in an Article 4 area, you will lose your C4 use. So you're a little bit tied there. You've got to make a decision that you can't go back on, that it's not going to be worth having as a HMO, has more value as a family let. There is a logic to say that because of the restriction on supply of HMOs in a C4 area, in an Article 4 area, that they would command a higher value than a family let. Now, that might come into play in my area, but it hasn't come into play, maybe a little bit. And the reason is it's just a heavy supply of HMOs. It's not difficult to find them. I am not sure what the effect of Brexit will be, but I'm not exposed to that now with having got rid of HMOs. I will always go back if necessary into the HMO market. It's one of those pragmatic decisions you make. Will it work? The answer is yes, do it. If not, don't do it. Simple as. I make my own decision, but it'll be based on factors such as I'll analyse it. I'm a bit analytical. I'll analyse it thoroughly before committing. And if like I say, it's not just about the money. It's about the risk. It's about the hassle. And do I need it? Well, the answer is I'm not desperate. I'm quite comfortable, thank you. So if I need it, I could always use more money and increase my asset base. But when I earn more money, I'm not one to just spend it. I'm one to invest it and try and generate more money, and build and build and build. I presume you've read the Rich Dad books. I have.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the fundamental qualities you need as a property investor. You need to be able to manage money. You don't go out splashing the cash until you've made it. Otherwise, you might find there's a bad time around the corner. I always tell people that problems don't come in ones, they come in threes. You don't just get the boiler breaking down. You get the tenant leaving, the boiler breaks down, and then the council are jumping on you for council tax. All of it's money. If you got the money reserved, and any of my properties I've got that. I'll tell you something. Last week, I had a fire at a property, one of my own. Stupid tenant his friends decided to have a fire in the back garden too close to the house. Burnt the window, melted the frame, broke the glass, burnt the guttering, the fascia, and this one's got external insulation on, burnt that as well. That tenant's got a notice on him, because there's been other issues as well. He's lost control, his friends are taking liberties and harassing people nearby, and I can just do without it. I can afford to get rid of him. Money isn't going to be the factor short term, because it won't hurt me. So we'll do the repairs on insurance. He's got the notice. He will be going, and when he is going, this is a flat. The flat above, the woman there wants his flat, and she's got a friend for her flat. And she's been brilliant. So hopefully I will have both of those flats rented again. Now it's hassle, it's expense, it's an insurance claim, there are other costs as well. Those flats make me a profit of about £450 a month. This year will not be a good year. I'll probably get about £2,000 profit on that one because of all the factors involved. But hopefully if this flat stays in for a few years, I will get £5,000 a year profit. That's all right, isn't it?
It's better than a kick in the privates.
Yeah, how many of those do you need to live?
No. One.
Not kicks in the privates, but
just before we wrap up with a few sort of quick fires of what people might obviously gone through a lot of content. But if you were restarting and you were doing HMOs, or if I was, or people listening to this are, and they wanted to not manage them themselves, they wanted to find an agent to manage them, how would you go about finding an agent that has enough knowledge of HMOs and has the ability to manage them effectively? Would that be how would you go and find an agent that has that knowledge?
I would interview the agents because obviously I've got a lot of knowledge on this, but I would ask, I would recommend you get your knowledge up, you go on some training, you do some research, and be careful of Facebook, things like that, because there's all these experts on that. In fact, I just caught out a company on there who were advertising. Thought, that's wrong, and that's wrong. Oh, they're a bit shoddy. You've got to be careful there. But so go to more than one source, and then get your knowledge. It doesn't have to be perfect, but then gives you the ability to test the agent. What are your inspection procedures like? How frequently do you inspect a property? How do you gain access? I mean, we've got keys on the outside of our HMOs in key safes, and we can always gain access. That gas engineer who called me, is it a HMO? No problem with access. It's a room by room let HMO bed sits, and so we don't need to give notice to go into the communal area, and you can just go in, no problem with that. So we'll get things like that work well. So these little things, systems in place. And then one of the things that can kill your profit is their costs. I'll tell you a little story. I used to have this brilliant guy, a plumber, Polish. His work was good, his service was good, he was keen, and he was cheap. Not suspiciously cheap, but good price. Friday afternoon, he gets a call from one of the main agencies in Hull, and he's got a job. They're desperate for him to go to deal with his toilet, and he went in and looked at it. He thought, I don't want to do this. So he priced it up at £43, so he thought, I'll sod it. He doubled it, 86. The girl on the end of the phone said, please do it. And then he thought, hang on a minute. This isn't just doubling my profit, because that 43 included my labour, included my materials. So this is like 2.5 times the profit. So that ruined him. His prices went up, and he can work less and earn more because he's found out that he can charge more money. And that just showed that agent was not keen on the prices. They weren't up to date. Didn't have the finger on the pulse. Didn't know what to charge people. Didn't know what, when a builder was not interested in a job and charging too much, she should have gone to another plumber. And she's ruined my plumber because of that. And so people are like that. They're spending other people's money when they're managing properties. Some of them are not keen on getting the price down. And added to that, often they charge a percentage themselves. So if they've got the price down, they've got their price down as well. So if they can get away with it, they will charge more. It's lazy, it makes them more money. And you can see the reason for it. And so be careful on that sort of thing. And then you've got to keep a good rapport with your agent, keep in touch with them. This one, where there was a fire in the property, it's in Grimsby, I engage an agent there. But the guy keeps me in touch. It's an easy call for me. He rang me up on Thursday morning, and I didn't jump down his throat because there's been a fire. It wasn't his fault. It was a tenant being stupid. But he's done all he can. He's acted immediately, and I'm thanking him. I'm grateful for it. And he's getting things sorted for me, and I'm doing the insurance side and bits and pieces. And he served the notice. We've worked together, and that will reduce the problems, because you'll always have problems with property. When people are selling your property, they'll give you the potential rent, and that's going to be in a perfect situation, which you rarely actually get over a full year. When you do get that, you need to be grateful.
Yeah, that's so true. It's the devil's in the detail. It's about the numbers and, keeping or, getting the data. And then, like you said, you then can look back on it for the last 12 months, 24 months, 36 months to analyse it properly. Just going into dipping a little bit into training, and then we wrap up with a few quick fires. So when people on the various trainings that you do give, what are the most common queries or concerns that you hear from people when they're discussing HMOs for the first time?
People get confused between licensing and planning, and then the numbers. Why is it I need a license? Is it why is it a HMO at 3 or more, but I don't need a license till 5 or more? Well, it's because it's the way it is. The definition of a HMO is 3 or more people, 2 or more family groups, and that's not the same as a definition for a mandatory license, and people get that confused, because that's 5 or more people, 2 or more family groups. Then there's additional licensing, which can be any number of people, 2 or more family groups. And then there's planning, which, as I said earlier, planning are different animals to environmental health. They're looking at the area, the amenity, the effect on people living there, the mixture of tenure, what you do to the building that affects that. Environmental health are looking at the safety of people living there, people visiting there, and people walking by even. So you've got to consider all that. Look at them differently, but go to planners first. You want to make sure that you can use it for what you want, because environmental health, if you comply, you get your license and you don't get problems. With planners, it's an opinion. They'll ask for a consultation, and then you've got to comply with their policy. And if they are not complying with their policy, it's a means of appeal. But if your application doesn't comply with their policy, you don't get the license, the planning permission. So people get confused of that. You've got to recognise the difference. And people assume, because they're from the same council, that they are the same, and they're not. And I have seen examples where there's a little bit of rivalry between them. Some planners, they don't see why environmental health aren't in their section, and planning has got to make its own money, and they've got to do various things as environmental health get funding, although it's switching to more close to self-funding now. You see things such as that, so there can be a bit of rivalry among them, between them. So they don't necessarily talk to each other. Please don't assume they do. They should, but if they don't, they don't. And you've got to be the one who does your own research and finds out for yourself, I'm afraid.
I completely agree with that. It's the best investment, as you say, is in yourself. That's learn, study, read, do what you need to do, speak to people. All of that is completely applicable. Where do you see HMOs being as a strategy in the next 20, 30 years? Do you think they'll still be around? Do you think there's going to be significant changes?
They'll be around. There is a demand for them. They're needed. I think they will be better than they have been. HMOs go back 10, 20 years. Some of them were awful. They needed a lot of work on it. And you still get some old landlords saying, why should I do this? Now you're thinking, why you shouldn't be a landlord? But they'll be around. They'll always be around. There is a demand for them. There's been a bit of an oversupply at the moment in a lot of places, not everywhere. That will rectify itself. And I think you'll end up with HMOs divided to some extent. They are divided. You'll have the bottom end of the market for people on benefits, maybe with support within there. You'll have things such as the student market, which is a different type of occupancy. And then you'll have the young professionals who maybe don't want to live with a bunch of students who, with their behaviour, they've got to go out to work every day, but they've got more money. And so their expectations are higher. But they don't want to have the hassle of bills or the expense of somewhere self-contained because they've maybe got student debts behind them. And so there'll always be, and then there's migrant workers and there's even contract workers, things such as that. So there's always going to be demand for HMOs, I think. It's just getting the pitch right, getting the rent level right, and making sure you're regulated. And if you are, that's fine. I think licensing is going to be accepted, and you're going to have to be on the ball and make sure that you've got your regular visits and your regular checks and things in place. But factor all that into the cost, and there's profit in there for you. Higher profit, but you work harder for it. So I think they'll always be there, definitely, and particularly in some big cities, especially London. So expensive to live there. HMOs are the only option for some people. I think there'll be a thinning out of some of them, and the ones who fall out of the market are the ones who maybe milked them too much and not invested in the property, or they've got the numbers wrong, and then they end up with the worst of all worlds. They've got a worse HMO and a lower income. Because they've got empty rooms. But the good ones they'll survive. There's a few challenges on the horizon: changes in student numbers, Brexit, the downturn of the economy with the pandemic. I don't know what effect that will have. Maybe more people in HMOs. Every Christmas there's a little bit of a jump in the number of people in HMOs because of people splitting up over Christmas. Yeah, they fulfil a need. I think they'll always be there. Definitely.
Fair enough. You mentioned at the start about training, so feel free to talk more about that and then how people can also find you and your company moving forward as well.
Yeah, well, Environmental Health Housing Services Limited, that's me, my company. I should very soon, I've been delayed by the pandemic, I should have my registration with the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health as one of their trainers. I can do the HHSRS training, which is the Housing Health and Safety Rating System training. That's on how to inspect and risk assess a property using the HHSRS system. And that's a proper qualification. That's a qualification the council officers need before they can visit our properties and inspect them. And it's 2 days separated by a couple of weeks with a homework in between, which is an inspection, and you will be marked. And if you're not good enough, you will fail. But once you've got that certificate, put it on your wall. And if you're a landlord, it shows you're a good landlord. And I would argue in many ways, you've got advantages over the council officers. Because most landlords are practically based and they've got an idea of costs and what's coming up on the market and what's practical and what's available. So it helps you assess those. And if you take an interest, it's a wonderful thing. You can put things into your properties. Training, there's a HMO training I can do. I also work with Advanced Asset Academy, who I work on the HMO course. I work in HMO licensing, HMO standards, teaching people about that. And I offer a consultancy service. If you've got a HMO, I can inspect it. I can process your license for you. I can risk assess your property for you. Of course, there's a cost, but it gives you peace of mind. And then if the council come round, you've got a defence, you've got protection. Also, I've appealed against many council served notices. And generally what you will find with an appeal, usually you either win or you'll lose, or you can either win, lose, or there's a compromise. Usually it's a compromise, but often councils are putting in things they cannot put in, and we can trim it down. Even if you're guilty, you can throw yourself at the mercy and plead mitigation. I had one once where a guy had a £3,000 fine. He was guilty. Simple as, he hadn't done something he should have done. He hadn't done it. We managed to get it down by £750. It's a bonus. He saved some money, but at the end of the day, he's going to go around and he's not going to make that mistake again. So it's life. You do these things. And it's always worth looking into these things. Councils can be a bit sloppy. I tend to find when they've been to visit properties and they've served notice and you suddenly request their risk assessment and their inspection and risk assessments, but they come back with you look on the profiles, you find they were compiled after the notice, which means they haven't risk assessed the property. they get caught out easily on something such as that. But that's why we keep them on their toes. And it's always worth doing.
Nah, absolutely. In terms of email address, website, anything like that where people can get hold of you?
Yes, the website is going to be up and running very soon, and it's let me think about it. There we go. It's ehhs-uk.co.uk, and then I'm going to have the email of office@ehhs, that's abbreviation for Environmental Health Housing Services, ehhs-uk.co.uk. Feel free to contact me, or we will have the website up and running. You can leave a message on there with your contact details, and we'll give you a free 30-minute consultation to assess your situation, so you're not being charged straight away. And then we'll give you an idea of what you can do.
Perfect stuff. And as usual, we'll have links to all of that in the show notes. Ian, just a big thank you for your time. And do you have any final words of wisdom for people listening?
I'm not one of these gurus who's gone into property and made $1 million overnight. I've been plugging away at it since 2006, but it's served me very well. There are ups and downs, but the key is with me is I'm managing my money and managing my properties. I keep them up to a good standard. Because of that, I spend more on them than maybe some of them would, but at the moment I've got one empty which is being renovated, and there's one going to be empty which will be full within a couple of weeks. I tend to have a good occupancy rate, a low void rate, low arrears rate. You get more problems with worse properties. You attract the worst tenants, and your good tenants don't stay. A lot of it is about man management, or people management, we should say these days, and treating people like human beings. I spend often more on my properties than I do on my own. I'll always get round to a job at my own house, but my property, you can't wait. You got to get it done. But you do, and it's. I am fairly hands-on, but that's not a problem. I'm quite interested in it. I like doing it.
Oh, good stuff. Well, thank you for sharing everything, and thank you for sharing the ups and downs and the absolute realism of doing what you're doing. I think that's important for everyone listening. So just again, thank you very much for your time.
No problem, Rob. Good to speak to you.